In my previous video studying the James Bond films, I outlined in detail the many obvious and subtle points that strongly suggest that the movies are designed and structured in similar ways to circuses and spectacular shows, which is a sort of self-acknowledgement by the filmmakers of the silly fantasy nature of the movies. This video you are watching is a follow-up study. Most of this video have new observations, some of them overlap with some points in my previous video. But this video focuses on artistic license in these movies, as demonstrated on multiple levels. For those of you who do not know what that means, an artistic license, in relation to movies, is when the creators of the fictional narratives intentionally steps away from realism how often they want, which can result in scenes having plot holes or characters managing to successfully perform tasks or traverse dangerous obstacles that would not be possible in real life, all for the sake of finding less plausible but more suitable ways for enhancing the entertainment value or the artistic content of the movies. This video goes into this topic and how the classic Bond movies still emotionally engage us on different levels despite their unrealistic and sometimes clearly comedic presentation, from winking nudges to the use of imaginative and semi-plausible technology, the basic conceptual design of the James Bond character, historical parallels, the weird supernatural subtext in some of the movies, and some of the notable points. Like with my previous video, I am only focusing on all of the James Bond films up to The Living Daylights, though I will mention the later Bond films every now and then when they become relevant. If you happen to have mixed or negative feelings for some of the Bond movies, particularly the ones with Roger Moore, that's okay, even though I love all of the Roger Moore Bond movies, and I do like most of the Bond movies generally. There are minor gripes raised by reviewers that I still partially agree with. But if you happen to hate Moonraker or Octopussy because they are far too silly, I will be addressing those points as we go along. You might be particularly interested in what I have to say in chapters 6 and 7, which will explore some of the real-life history details of espionage and gadgets that are actually even more silly than what is presented in any of the Bond films. I'll also say here, before I say anything critical to those movies, I'll point out here that I actually do enjoy some of the later Bond films, and I personally quite like License to Kill, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale. Daniel Craig is a good actor, and Casino Royale has really good moments. The only Bond movie I absolutely dislike is Quantum of Solace, but I think Skyfall and Spectre are just okay personally. I've only seen them once though, so I'm still alright with watching the new Bond movies, including the upcoming installment, No Time to Die. Before we start, I must address the misleading debate of quality between the sillier Bond movies, which especially tends to happen in the movies starring Roger Moore, and the supposedly serious, mature, dark, gritty, and dramatic Bond films, though many Bond fans and the filmmakers themselves instead describe those movies as simply being more realistic. They tend to cite the early Sean Connery films, the Timothy Dalton films, and the Daniel Craig films as examples of the best James Bond movies on account of these labels by default. The debate of realism in Bond movies has come from two different angles. First, there are reviewers who complain of this Bond film or that Bond film having physical and narrative implausibilities that literally would not work in real life, and they can make a big deal out of them. Yes, there are loads of examples which I will explore in this video, including the movies that the harsh critics and audiences tend to prefer, but any major plot holes by themselves don't spoil the movie experience if the actual content is still good in its own right, are so good that audiences forgive the narrative discrepancies. The key example of this point is in this scene from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. George Lazenby's Bond infiltrates Blofeld's headquarters under the guise of being a genealogist. He disguises his accent, but not his face. This is a movie immediately following You Only Live Twice, which stars Sean Connery, who meets Blofeld as played by Donald Pleasence. But Blofeld, here played by Telly Savalas, has not recognised Bond at all until later in the film. I have found no explanation from the creators of the movie. Online forums believe that the scriptwriters were being faithful to the original novel by Ian Fleming, which came before the novel version of You Only Live Twice. That's possibly true. I'll add as well that they were probably rushed in writing the story by the deadline. I have read that scriptwriters were considering giving background logic to replacement actor of Sean Connery with George Lazenby as James Bond, such as plastic surgery, because his original face was already becoming too well known to potential and influential enemies on the planet. But there is no evidence in the movie to suggest this. There is the interesting online theory of James Bond being a code name in itself, which would explain the changes of the actors, but it doesn't add up because there are scenes in the later films which show Bond, played by Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton, as having the very same wife who was killed on Her Majesty. But anyway, back on point. The plot hole in On Her Majesty is so obvious before it had occurred to me when I first watched it, as many people did I assume, but it seems a number of people are forgiving of that plot hole because everything else about that movie is very good for the most part, and it still has its praise. It was bold of the filmmakers to have gone ahead with filming this scene, and they got away with it. The scene is fine as it is if you ignore the discrepancy, though I might be biased in that I always enjoy watching Telly Savalas on screen. And like I said, there are plot holes and unrealism in other movies which the more sensitive viewers typically prefer. Dr. No is full of them. Here, Bond's disguise could have easily been blown, being a few yards up close to Dr. No. But apparently Dr. No is colorblind. And yet plenty of people really rate this movie. It's pretty good, but it's definitely not my favourite of the series. The YouTube channels CinemaSins and Creative Learning had already gone through the sheer unrealism and blind luck in the Daniel Craig films. I'll let you watch them in your own time. But here I will mention one plot hole issue in License to Kill which I found funny and does not get talked about at all. Bond gets himself exposed to the aroma of cocaine 3 times in the story, most especially when he has a near-death situation with a cocaine grinder which floods the atmosphere with cocaine particles all over his face and his clothes. It was pointed out earlier in this sequence that face masks have to be worn indoors because of the risk of this crowd feeling symptoms from exposure. Symptoms of getting high, that is. Despite this, Bond is shown to not get high on cocaine, or be shown to have medical complications of any kind due to the high overdose in the atmosphere. Even the henchman who tries to kill Bond looks high himself.
You're dead.
Sure, getting high on cocaine does not cause hallucinations from what I've read, but still there are no indications in the finished movie where Bond's behaviour and physical health, and those of that cute American babe for that matter, are affected by this huge exposure, so it comes off as an oversight by the scriptwriters. I need to say again, plot holes by themselves do not spoil the movie experiences if there are enough good stuff going on to make up for its flaws. I do agree with Creative Learning's video, but reading up the comment sections of that video and reading up a good production history book, Some Kind of Hero, had opened up to me another aspect of the appeals of those movies. The second angle on the debate of realism comes from viewers who do recognise the unrealism of every Bond movie, but they still attach the realism label to movies they prefer because they lack the over-the-top and cartoonish aesthetics of the other Bond films, which they think are too silly. And the presentation of those movies appear more mature and serious, which artificially implies those films to have some genuine and worthwhile sense of drama with supposedly well-written stories and characters that are believable to viewers in terms of dramatics or emotional engagement. I believe that angle is central to the appeal of supposedly serious and mature Bond films, and I can understand that viewpoint. I mean, there are dark and serious adult movies which had plot holes and unrealistic cliches of their own, such as Death Wish 2 and Blade Runner. Some plot holes in Blade Runner are severe. They did get in the way of casually enjoying the viewing experience, but overall they are still excellent movies, and they had some powerful scenes that are well executed. At multiple points in the book Some Kind of Hero, the many different filmmakers and creative collaborators have been so divided on how to balance the fantasy extravagant entertainment with some kind of realism to make the story semi-believable for audiences to buy into. Even in Octopussy. But people do recognise that movies like Octopussy were meant to be silly, and they still enjoy that movie on the sheer entertainment level. However, when it comes to the supposedly more serious and gritty Bond movies, they have set estimations of dramatic quality higher than before, intended to be effective and well-written pieces of drama. We can argue about whether or not the plot holes, blind lock, and unrealistic contrivances of those movies are jarring enough to be considered contrary to the intentions of the filmmakers of constructing movies that have dramatically strong stories and characters. But as the YouTuber Creative Learning had said, the big weak spot of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and I say it's also true of License to Kill and some of the original novels by Ian Fleming, is that their basic stories and situations are quite generic and dull, and these movies intentionally restrict themselves in terms of creativity and originality. Even a lot of dialogue in those movies tend to be dull and generic. Some people are aware of this truth deep down, hence Quantum of Solace and Spectre divided audiences despite having the same realistic presentation of Casino Royale. Sure, the Bond franchise recycles the basic premise of a secret agent who thwarts the evil master plans of evil rich people, but the earlier movies kept introducing new twists, new jokes, new gadgets, sometimes new locations, new kinds of action pieces. It mixes different sporting activities together in places, and so on. They kept refreshing themselves, but the weaker Bond films, especially the ones with Daniel Craig, they just looked less inventive by comparison. The big giveaway of a lack of originality in the Bond films of the late 1980s up to this day are all of these wallpaper posters. Compared to the extravagant posters from the older Bond films, which showcase the fun and excitement the movie's set pieces promise, ever since License to Kill, all of the posters display are the central cast of those movies, which suggests that the filmmakers have been prioritizing character drama as a means of making the franchise cool, serious, mature, intelligent, dramatic, and whatever fancy label they want to apply. When the franchise's desire to insist upon itself with these labels become the overdriving priority, it all became style over substance, as they say. But for various complex reasons to do with the changes of the social and legal landscapes of the real world, on top of a significant drop of quality in modern film industries generally, the Bond franchise has never shined as well ever since The Living Daylights. It only managed to make some decent Bond films. Even before License to Kill though, there were already moments in the previous Bond movies which were dark and serious when certain scenes require it. And I've seen a number of reviews saying the Bond countdown scene in Octopussy Circus is surprisingly suspenseful to reviewers, emotionally dramatic, and that's with Bond wearing a clown costume. Dramatic power is not restricted to certain genres or aesthetics. It's good to have emotional variety anyway, and the whole movies can still feel emotionally consistent and congruent if the execution is suitably well done. The likes of Octopussy have never lied about their intentions to be family fun action comedies, and this emotional framing allowed the films to get away with silly moments, plot holes, and some minor flaws. In some ways it can be argued that this framing gave the franchise more creative scope, especially the sexual innuendos. The filmmakers' acknowledgement of the unrealism of the Bond films manifested in many different details, a lot of them being very sneaky, and sometimes they place in jokes to that effect. From Russia with Love, Bond is compared to a heartthrob film actor.
Of course, girls do fall in love with pictures of film stars.
But not a Russian cipher clerk with a file photo of a British agent.
And hey, here is the actor Sean Connery. In Moonraker, there is the prominent product placement of a fizzy drink 7-Up. The filmmakers and critics commented a lot about the product placement of this movie, but would this particular placement on this cable car building be referring to 007 going up on this cable car to the top of a mountain? I wasn't too sure because 7-Up logos are featured elsewhere, but then I clicked onto the fact, from a DVD commentary of that movie, that the following musical piece is loosely based on the theme tune of a classic western film, The Magnificent Seven. A lot of these kinds of in-jokes tend to be in the Sean Connery and Roger Moore films the most, and they became quite absent by the time Timothy Dalton came on the scene. I am confident in saying that the last genuinely great Bond film was The Living Daylights. To this day, that film is far more creative, interesting, original, and enjoyable than all of the other Bond films that came since. Like I said, I do quite like License to Kill, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale. They all have good moments which makes them worth a watch. It's just that compared to the other Bond films, these movies just felt watered down by comparison, in terms of conception and execution. And frankly, all of the James Bond films do have their weak spots, some of them being small, some of them being large. We could be talking all day on this subject. There are a few more critical points to say regarding the dramatic intentions of portraying James Bond as a cool, relatable, tough guy, but I will save those points when we go around to examining some of the core conceptual principles of a James Bond character. For this study though, the wide debate of realism in the James Bond franchise I consider to have naturally occurred because of how the James Bond films tap into multiple aspects of the real world that led us to make assumptions of espionage, technology, and human capability, with some assumptions having some shreds of truth, while others are false. We all know these films are pure fantasy, but when the franchise is at its best, when all of the crucial conceptual and aesthetic details are collectively done perfectly right, we suspend our disbelief for the entertainment. Okay, with all that said, on with the show. The repeated metaphors of circuses in the obvious details immediately raises a question mark as to what the creative intentions of the filmmakers are. The basic concept of a single secret agent who goes around the world thwarting evil master plans again and again, getting into very dangerous situations and fights, seducing many women without getting any of them pregnant, ride around very expensive spy cars that sometimes gets ruined, and get the job done with maybe some wounds but no permanent injuries. All of this is inherently unrealistic in many ways. There are all kinds of implausibilities in these movies, but because I got some other interesting points to make, I won't make this section too long. I'll only outline the more significant and funny points, with an emphasis on how these logic-defying moments actually are requirements for the entertaining action movie narrative, such as being able to show extravagant stunts that otherwise would not happen, keep a narrative ball rolling without the need of unnecessary extra scenes, or actually help with the dramatics of non-action scenes. Some of the details may be results of rushed scripting and shooting schedules, but audiences are forgiving of such leaps of logic if everything else about those movies are well done, and if the basic character dynamics of the main characters are dramatically decent enough. Some movies like the original Star Wars trilogy are well known for doing this well. In general terms spanning the franchise, while Bond can sometimes be unlucky so he isn't presented too much as a lucky guy, Bond does keep having blind luck of narrowly escaping danger by very fortunate circumstances. There's a cliche of villains having a number of opportunities to kill Bond on the spot and thus eliminate the only significant threat of foiling their plans, but as part of being memorable villains, and sometimes because of their egos, they instead try to subject Bond to more horrendous fate, which they sometimes don't intend to see anyway.
The purpose of our two previous encounters is now very clear to me. I do not intend to be distracted by another. Good night, Mr. Bond.
I shall be leaving you in your own private crematorium. Mr. Bond, Dr. Goodhead, I bid you farewell.
EPS, power on. EPS power. 9, 7, 6, 5.
Bang on time.
4.
Come on, quick.
3.
Or challenge him to a duel for the sport of it.
I could have shot you down when you landed, but that would have been ridiculously easy.
There's a notable cliche of henchmen being so easily not unconscious. Though Bond can be tapped on the head as well. When Bond gets knocked unconscious and captured, sometimes the villains have Bond's gadgets still on him or nearby. Some henchmen are bad shots, they may as well be stormtroopers.
Keep going.
And they sometimes slowly draw their gun or some kind of weapon towards characters who they intend to kill, but they get shot themselves. Similarly, in Moonraker, there are a few henchmen who are so baffled by Bond's surprise modification on his vehicles that they do not fire their machine guns. Bond tends to be at the right place at the right time. And why do the villains keep giving plot spoilers to Bond when they don't need to? Which gives Bond the advantage to think of more possibilities of effectively foiling their plans. Some of them have their reasons, such as boosting their egos or trying to impress Bond, with Scaramanga having the shared kind of spirit in some ways. Although he was lucky that the only other Caucasian guy in an Asian boxing match did not overhear what he said here.
You see, Mr. Bond, I always thought I liked animals. And I discovered that I like killing people even more.
Only Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever was wise not to tell Bond of his plans.
What do you intend to do with those diamonds?
An excellent question. And one which will be hanging on the lips of the world quite soon. If I were to break the news to anyone, it would be to you first, Mr. Bond. You know that. But it's late, I'm tired, and there's so much left to do.
Although surveillance technology, like surveillance cameras, was present even in the 1960s, there are a number of moments where Bond sneaks his way through buildings run by mega-rich villains. No cameras around. Well, the villains have got the spare money, so why not buy some cameras and guards? Speaking of guards, there are moments where the main villain takes on Bond himself, but with no guards around them to back them up, if the villain is becoming too unfortunate. Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me has a whole load of followers around him, but he never bothered having guards in his own submersible ocean lair at the ending. Not even staff members for targeting and shooting down the submarine that is set out to destroy Stromberg's base anyway. Sure, there is Jaws, but he has proven himself to be unreliable for killing Bond a number of times already, so what chance does he have with Bond in this movie? In Live and Let Die, these guys are all around Bond with their machine guns, but they went away for coffee break, which is convenient enough for Bond to take on the boss one-on-one. In similar principles, while there are scenes where Bond battles with multiple henchmen at once, there are also other scenes where Bond takes on a single henchman one-on-one, and the single henchman does not have any backup with him in case the plan to kill Bond falls through. Sure, it can be said to be a natural part of assassinations and espionage, and maybe they're driven by the ego of single-handedly fighting our hero and trying to kill him. But then again, if the likes of Jaws were able to have multiple henchmen with him in some scenes, then he could have easily asked for backup if he needs it. But for dramatic purposes though, the number of characters on screen are limited to just the key performers, no distractions whatsoever. Sometimes there are simple solutions to technical problems such as pulling the plug, or finding the right switch. Going to more specific examples of implausibilities, when Bond has clear aim of villains who themselves give Bond the time to play his move, Bond, who himself is presented with superb aim, tries headshots that don't work instead of just aiming at their legs or their balls.
Alright, you've had your 8. Now I'll have my 80.
But if he did shoot them at their legs or balls, then we wouldn't get to see the more spectacular moments.
How does that grab you?
Although a number of villains die, this one in Believing Daylight is incredibly lucky to survive this accident. Bond skates through a similar kind of explosive risk in From Russia with Love. In The Man with a Golden Gun, when Bond tries escaping a martial arts training ground, his Chinese ally left him behind. Even his ghost protested. This can be thought of as flimsy writing. However, this is a requirement for Bond to pursue alternative escape routes. He chooses a speedboat, which kicks in the chasing. From Russia with Love, when Bond and others stormed the Soviet embassy to steal the decoding machine, it seems there was only one guard in the house. In Moonraker, Bond hardly ever uses his wrist dart gun when there are plenty of opportunities for him to use it to his advantage. On a pure aesthetic angle, Bond has gadgets which makes racketing sounds in the middle of the night. That should wake some people up. Sure, there are metal detectors that use these kinds of arcade sounds, but here's a silent bug detector.
Oh, room service? This is Mr. Bond, Bungalow 12. I'd like a bottle of Bollinger, please. Slightly chilled. 2 glasses.
So the noisy sound effects used in Moonraker are pure aesthetics for illustrating the sophisticated automated technology. And the sound effects sound quite pleasing by themselves for some reason, quite cartoonish. Then there's the issue of having to go into wildlife territory where all kinds of wild animals and diseases thrive about. Here in Octopussy, Bond splashes into the waters of India and he picks up a leech. Maybe there's crocodile shit in there too. According to the DVD commentary for Octopussy, the filmmakers have sent test samples to all scientists who came back to them and said that this is very unhealthy to drink from. If Bond happens to drink any of that water, at the very least he will have a severe case of diarrhea for the next day or two. And here's a funny one made in the opening scene of The Living Daylights. Bond kills the assassin with a car exploding above the sea and fiery debris going everywhere. But immediately afterwards, he is seen gliding over a yacht featuring a woman who expresses boredom and has not heard the explosion.
It's all so boring here, Margot. There's nothing but playboys and tennis pros. If only I could find a real man.
I suppose she's disconnected from reality. Okay, last example. There has been some people complaining about the opening scene in Moonraker where Drax's henchmen hijacked and stole a Moonraker shuttle off of a delivery plane. They say that the shuttle would not have the fuel in it to begin with, according to airline delivery procedures, and the whole place would have been inspected before takeoff. Well, considering the details we have explored elsewhere so far, it's no big deal really. And besides, without that opening scene, the movie would not have jump-started. Those are just some of the examples of unrealism I have picked up from these movies, some of them being in the more universally praised Bond movies like Goldfinger, The Spy Who Loved Me and The Living Daylights. Even though some of the examples I've given I think could have been fixed, those dodgy logistics do not spoil the movie experiences for me. Many of them I have not even thought about until I rewatched them for this study. In fact, I say some of the unrealistic details help make the Bond movies dramatically better in different ways. Going back to my previous video studying the franchise, I have said before the gondola scene in Moonraker is likely a trolling stab at the snobbish critics and viewers who moaned of implausibilities and silliness of these movies. The adult crowd are shaken, not stirred, while kids are seen chasing after it. The filmmakers' intentions of making family movies outlined right there. The scene is part of the recurring jokes of the characters having a swig of alcohol before they witnessed the unbelievable. They look at their bottles like they're doubting their minds, even though they actually saw the seemingly impossible and fantastic happening right in front of their bland everyday existence. It very much parallels the critics and audiences being annoyed of certain moments in the movies, such as that double blinking pigeon. I wonder as well if this close-up of a sailor guy is meant to represent some aspect of the audience perhaps. This character clearly is serving some sort of navy, and Bond himself is commander from a naval background, so is he aspiring to be an action hero like Bond or Rambo? Or is the military identity there just to make him look cool? Well, he wears a silly uniform and hat like he's Donald Duck. Meanwhile, Bond here is dressed for business meetings. At the same time, I have heard of complaints that Bond has blown his secret agent cover by parading in public. Of course the filmmakers knew about that. I mean, this guy here has 2 cameras on him. There is no definite indication that this guy is a secret agent anyway. He could equally have passed himself off as an eccentric inventor or a publicity advertiser. It's a comedy scene anyway. If you can't appreciate that basic principle, then you are as baffled as these guys.
You must excuse me, gentlemen, not being English. I sometimes find your sense of humor rather difficult to follow.
While I have been going through the older Sean Connery movies, I came across these little quotes where characters voice the rejective rationality of snobbish critics in these stories. I suspect these quotes were intended to artificially make the fantastic events and circumstances shown on screen seem more plausible.
If this Petacci was involved, is it conceivable that he could have used a false eye?
Oh, do come along, Bond. Let's think of a more logical explanation, shall we?
Some of these kinds of quotes actually come from James Bond himself, the protagonist showing the thoughts of the audience.
Well, I don't know too much about cryptography, sir, but I like to could decode their top secret signals. The whole thing's so fantastic, it just could be true.
That had occurred to me.
Who are you?
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
In Goldfinger, Q outlines an eccentric part of the Aston Martin, the ejector seat, and the filmmakers cleverly incorporate the snobbish critics' rejective rationality by having Sean Connery's Bond basically saying it is silly, only to be rebutted by Q saying it is for real.
Ejector seat, you're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
This kind of conversation is carried over to this scene in You Only Live Twice.
A toy helicopter?
No, it's certainly not a toy.
You'll see.
Roger Moore also expressed his disbelieving attitude, but this is much more subtle.
That's my little octopusy.
And his comments on the silliness of his situations may as well be him commenting on the silliness of the stories he is in.
A gun in a bag of peanuts, how original. What will they think of next? This should run a few electric toothbrushes. It used to be a convincing act, Rosie. It's wearing a little thin now.
This cop in A View to a Kill does not buy James Bond's story.
Well, actually, Captain, I'm with the British Secret Service. The name is Bond. James Bond.
Is he?
Are you?
Yes.
And I'm Dick Tracy, and you're still under arrest.
Relevant to the issue of plot holes in the Bond movies, the film adaptation of Goldfinger was bold to voice the critical responses to the plot hole of the original novel by Ian Fleming, where the villain's master plan was just a simple bank robbery.
Yes, well, I've worked out a few statistics of my own.
$15 billion in gold bullion weighs 10,500 tons. 60 men would take 12 days to load it onto 200 trucks. Now, at the most, you're going to have 2 hours before the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines move in and make you put it back.
But the film adaptation corrected the original novel's plot hole by making a more plausible and much more interesting master plan of a villain's intention to affect economics by contaminating America's gold supply. This master plan itself showed how smart the filmmakers were, and that the franchise was already not just your average action movie. It's a standard trick of fictional stories, magic trick demonstrations, and sometimes the more ordinary services and advertisements in the real world to voice the rejected rationality of its audiences before impressing them with something that is genuinely good, that audiences either didn't think was possible or was better than they expected. This preparation tactic is reliable when done well. It lets audiences know that they aren't insulting their intelligence and that they may have something genuinely good to offer. Upon looking at lists of greatest screen heroes, the James Bond character tends to be ranked high on the lists, sometimes just behind Indiana Jones, who was himself partially inspired by the James Bond films. Through the different incarnations spanning nearly 60 years of the movie franchise, James Bond has connected with many audiences around the world, and I don't believe it's just about the basic conceptual appeals of the character itself. There are many action movie characters who overlap a lot with Bond's basic persona and abilities, and yet they tend to not generate as much interest, or be laughed at, in good or bad ways. So obviously there's more to Bond than simply be presented as a swell spy. I am convinced that there are plenty of interlocking details which contribute to a strong appeal of a character in its different incarnations, but for this video I am going to try to stick closely to the artistic license angle, though I will include a few additional points in the mix for you to ponder the next time you watch these movies. Oh, and by the way, we are going to mainly focus on the positive characteristics and positive appeals of a character. I know there has been some discussion online regarding the dark psychological appeals of a character, some of them calling James Bond a psychopath. Now, while there are definitely some interesting and dark things to say about the Bond films if we really go psychoanalytical, I think those discussions have been somewhat generalised and misinterpreted to an extent. In fact, there are some traits described in those discussions which are true in some movies, especially the Daniel Craig films, but are outright contradicted by moments in other movies. For example, in A View to a Kill, the henchwoman Mayday who tried to kill Roger Moore's Bond before, she switched sides and decides to sacrifice her own life to save the day. But Bond keeps pleading for her to live. And that is in spite of him knowing that time is really running out and perhaps this is the only option left. So Bond, at least played by Roger Moore, is not a completely remorseless guy as some people claim. And we'll get more into that sort of thing later in this chapter. Okay, I will start with Bond's intellectual abilities, because, as with other great heroes on screen and in real life, it's not just about being a tough guy with fast reflexes, as is mainly the case with Daniel Craig's portrayal. We are definitely drawn to smart people, especially in modern society today, where a lot of our physical aggression has been pushed to the side. At least, that is what society encourages us to do. In favour of intellectual prowess to impress others, and to defend ourselves in social and legal contexts. But when it comes to intelligence, in the same way some people aren't most impressed with tough guys who display the brightest of their feathers, people aren't as into guys who show off as knowing a lot of things, but are still social dunces, or are completely stupid in using their knowledge in practical situations. No, we want people who know useful and practical stuff and know how to use them effectively. James Bond may have an educated background, but he is also described as having a background in the army, where he might have gained some insight and honed his intelligence, physical strength and reflexes, but for all we know he might have gained these qualities and wisdom of a practical sense earlier in his life going back to childhood. He also mentioned a real stuntman just before he did a corkscrew stunt, as if he takes inspiration from real people who did very dangerous stunts.
I sure am, boy. Never heard of Evel Knievel?
Though he admitted what he just did is unrealistic.
I've never done that before.
Neither have I, actually.
He certainly does things and says things which cardboard good guys and henchmen don't do, despite some of them having education and army backgrounds too. For one thing, Bond is presented as a funny guy. Sean Connery and Roger Moore's Bond incarnations deliver good, witty and appropriate one-liners that make us laugh, but these quality jokes help the movie's presentation of Bond as a very smart guy. A guy who expands his thoughts in directions we would not really think of, right down to how he interprets and articulates what he sees.
Horrible woman.
Yes, she's had her kicks.
Mr. Big, where the hell does he fit into this mess?
A genuine Felix Leiter. Illuminating.
Well, he always did have an inflated opinion of himself.
Here, in Never Say Never Again, Sean Connery's Bond is placed at an awkward position, but suddenly remembers he has one gadget left on him. He is so fast with his thoughts here that he segues his sudden remembrance with a sudden joke.
Now write this. The greatest rapture in my life was afforded me in a boat in Nassau by Fatima Blush.
Just remember, it's against service policy for agents to give out endorsements.
Right!
And a safe opportunity to use his gadget.
Right now.
Bond is super intelligent. He knows a lot about different topics from marine life to physics without the need of textbook in hand.
They tell me the electricity is stored in here, somewhere. Science was never my strong point.
Superconductivity coils cooled by liquid helium. If I were you, I wouldn't stick my finger or anything else for that matter in there. At 453 degrees below zero, that liquid helium would break it off like an icicle.
You really know far more about it than I do, Mr. Bond.
We can debate how realistic his huge accumulation and recollection of knowledge is, but check out this scene in Live Let Die. This is one of a few Bond films where we get to see his apartment. I think the only other Bond film I can recall which we do get to see Bond's apartment is in the very first film, Dr. No. In his kitchen, he has this contraption for making coffee. It could just be product placement for a brand, La Parfumerie Europicola, and it was explained in a DVD commentary that this was pretty much a comedy moment for Bond to annoy M here.
Is that all it does?
However, we get to see Bond physically handling the machinery with all of its different valves and levers in a perfect sequence. He also has his cooking equipment in copper, which is the type of metal that conducts with heat the fastest, of course. You may not agree with me on what I think is going on here, but this is a constructed set, and the coffee machine from what I read was said to have been only used in restaurants rather than homes at the time the film was made. So I suspect this little scene contains suggestions of Bond's habitual interest of technology and engineering. As a well-educated man who gets results from practical means, rather than simply repeating words from textbooks, his honed knowledge and experience contributes to him recognizing opportunities faster on duty.
4, 3, 2, 1.
And as usual for good scripts generally, Bond thinks and acts upon ideas and opportunities which we wouldn't really think of doing in such a situation.
Kill him!
Of course, and this is an elementary point, some situations may be lenient with our hero, but some situations do require Bond to think on the spot. It helps when other characters are presented with having some sort of intelligence of their own, not just the villains. So it seems like the universe of James Bond is occupied with smart and resourceful people, like in the real world.
Must we come this way?
Yes. Throws the dogs off the scent.
Damn mosquitoes.
Oh, rub water all over yourself. It's the salt they're after.
Here in Live and Let Die, Solitaire, who has newfound love for Bond, helps him escape without giving herself away to her captors.
My only regret is I won't be there to see it.
In The Man with a Golden Gun, the character Goodnight wants Bond to know that she wants to get off Scaramanga's island and stay with Bond. But because Scaramanga is there on the same dining table with them, she has to communicate her actual intentions through bad acting.
The fried mushroom looks terribly interesting.
Yes, I'd noticed that. I'll get around to it later. Having fun in the sun, Goodnight?
Yes. I could stay here forever.
However, some of these characters can also be very dumb as well in turns. Like with Honey Whiter in Dr. No, she claims to be smart, but she's dumb enough to believe in dragons. And she gives a complete straw woman's argument that because there are real animals that dance, and animals which eat each other after copulation, then there is such thing as dragons. Honey also confessed to Bond, an authority figure, that she murdered her rapist with a poisonous spider.
Did I do wrong?
Well, it wouldn't do to make a habit of it.
Do you have a woman of your own?
Yeah, well, my kinds of women wouldn't eat me or poison me after making love. Honey Whiter is clearly an unrealistic character anyway, who is pretty much only remembered for her good looks. At the same time, her belief of a dragon existing on a tropical island was based on her experience on encountering the real danger, and she tried to rationalise it, even if it sounded silly. So it's part of the issue of a James Bond franchise playing into our perception of reality. Also, I think Honey Whiter is the very first adult character in the franchise who is infused with childlike mannerisms for children to identify with, and to make Bond appear to be a protective adult figure. It's a whole other subject really. It is there across the franchise. I already talked about this to an extent. James Bond, as an experienced man in his 40s and 50s, doubles up as a fantasy father figure for people on-screen and off-screen to look up to, and for him to protect them from bullies, abusive boyfriends, and abusive parental figures.
She thinks she's doing it all for Mother Russia. She takes her orders from Colonel Klebb.
However, there are little contradictions in The Man with a Golden Gun. Ever since I first saw the movie, I always thought Nick Nax's final scene where he tries to kill Bond and interrupts his copulation is like when a child interrupts mummy and daddy's private moment in bed. Daddy gets so annoyed he punishes him.
Ow! Let me out, you big bully!
Shut up.
But I've noticed Bond's affectionate attitude tends to be towards women. It's like they get the sugar daddy treatment. The male characters who are infused with child qualities tend to have less affinity from Bond. I think this is part of the knight in shining armour fantasy that is gender specific. It's not only a fantasy that appeals to just men though. This was an explicit point by Dana Broccoli, a woman, on page 563 of Some Kind of Hero. We want masculine men who can protect us. At least that's her point of view. Of course, we all know women do not want masculine men who are desperate for them.
Behave yourself, Mr. Bond.
And I am not complaining about these kinds of scenes in the Bond films, by the way. I mean, we see these sorts of things in much darker forms in other movies like Blade Runner. And you've got critical objections to that scene as well, and it's partially understandable. But those objections haven't really changed audiences' opinions about the whole Blade Runner movie. A lot of us still love Blade Runner from start to finish, regardless of that scene. And a lot of people know when to hold back in real life, even if there's an open invitation. And the guys who don't, yeah, well, they pretty much deserve whatever social and legal consequences come out against them. Besides, everyone, the filmmakers, the actors, the actresses, the critics, and the audiences, everyone always knew from the very beginning of the franchise that the idea of James Bond winning the affections of every good-looking woman in sight is completely stupid and unrealistic. Some scenes are clearly meant to be like scenes from the carry-on comedy films, whether we like them or not.
Sean kept fooling around during those scenes. It was quite funny. He did a Groucho Marx walk. Sort of come out of the shower and walked as Groucho Marx used to walk.
See you later,
alligator.
The films include scenes where women's unrealistic sexual attraction to Bond are so over the top, the films were effectively parodying their own unrealistic sexual fantasy reputation.
What are you doing? Here, cut it out. We haven't time for that. Later, perhaps.
Now you're on this. I hope we're going to have some gratuitous sex and violence.
I certainly hope so too.
But at least there are moments when Bond lets women have their way with him.
That's it.
There is a more beneficial therapy for a man's lower back.
Oh, really? What might that be?
There are also other things going on, such as how sexuality has been used by women and men to a partner's strategic disadvantage, like with real-life espionage, but we'll get to that in a later chapter. But anyway, back to the positive charms of Bond. Yes, going back to Dana Broccoli's comment, women do want men who they can trust to protect them and not become overly possessive or inappropriate. But there is a lot of additional variables required for men to actually attract women, when they become single, that is. And so, talking too straight and casual, like your local general practitioner, tends to bore women, and I say that from experience. A combination of humour, intelligence, confidence, and sensitivity is a good all-rounder. It doesn't always work, and there are many other men out there in the world who do have these sorts of qualities, but you can still make really good impressions on women, and be proud of it, without ever getting dirty. Roger Moore, in my opinion, fits the description more than any other Bond actor. This sleeping arrangement in Live and Let Die shows Bond isn't altogether a carnal guy. He is naked, but Solitaire still has her top on, so perhaps their sexual encounter they had together was more intimate. Looking into the two eyes with different colours must have been a unique sexual experience. Roger Moore's personality is so warm that, compared to other Bond actors who grin their teeth a lot, Roger Moore's incarnation tends to really lack anger. He's a lot more chilled and self-controlled of his emotions. It's something Spock of Star Trek has, and it's a virtue that society and fiction stories don't really emphasize enough. Self-control of emotions is a very useful principle to have in real life when confrontations get heated. In fact, some confrontational people rely on their targets being as angry as them so they can artificially feel justified in continuing their aggressive behaviour. People in real life are not normally this calm and emotionally controlled when an angry guy threatens your life.
You ain't gonna see the sunlight unless you answer me.
I had no idea you were so frightened of him.
Did you touch her?
When I see Kananga.
This kind of attitude does come with experience in real life, but in these movies, Rogers' chill persona is maintained in situations that real spies would not tolerate in real life. Take this scene in Octopussy, where Bond has his photo taken without consent.
Charge it to, room.
Oh, 27. Along with the champagne, I suppose.
I leave it at the desk.
He already knew that this photo was going to be used to his disadvantage later on, and he knew that this woman was going to do something sneaky to him, but he plays along with it, knowing the risk of death.
It's for me.
So that if I should depart this world, suddenly you'll have something to remember me by.
Something like that. It's for my scrapbook. I collect memories.
Well, let's get on with making a few.
Normally, spies would be panicking of the risk of being caught and properly tortured, but from what I understand of this scene, Roger Moore portrays Bond as a guy who is always up for adventure, and he likes to maintain friendly relations with his opposition like a diplomat. He went to bed with this woman despite knowing that she would still go along with plans to murder him if the circumstances suit her. I think intelligent men in real life will reject her sexual invitation out of caution. This carefree attitude is quite consistent across Roger Moore's movies, and it is there in some ways in the Sean Connery films, but more so in the Roger Moore films. Roger Moore was not always this casual though. His mannerisms can be quite firm when there are definitely lives of many at stake. When he's near death, he would naturally be pissed off in a moment with people he doesn't trust. He kills out of self-defense with the occasional revenge motive. This bloke coerced this woman into distracting Bond, but she can't go through with the guilt of being part of a murder, so she puts herself in the line of fire. I think that's the reason Bond spares him of his forgiveness. However, when it comes to other bad guys like Jaws, who completely scared him before, when he next encounters him, he still gives smiles to him instead of frowns. With Mayday, she switched sides after Max Lawrence's antics ruined her makeup, and she sacrificed her own life to save everyone in Silicon Valley and to spite Soren, despite Bond pleading to her to live. I wonder what Bond would have done to Mayday if she was somehow still alive and they still saved the day. Would he let her off the hook for her past crimes, or would he still hold her accountable with some leniency? He was threatening to kill this woman in Live and Let Die for playing a part in another agent's murder and luring him into the same trap. Considering his friendly attitude elsewhere, including Live and Let Die, I'm not sure if he really means to kill her or if he's just pressuring her. I mean, he could have shot her as she was running away. And with Gobinder, who did try to kill him earlier, he still offered him a friendly invitation, but I think it's more of an insult of his dedication to his master.
I don't suppose you'd care for a nightcap? No.
I don't think Bond's mostly friendly attitude towards most of his enemies is just a tactic he uses to acquire information, or to get free drinks. I think it might also be the case that it's a tactic he uses to find potential allies in his opposition, who themselves sometimes kill each other. After all, there have been people in real-life espionage who switched sides and defected to the country they were previously operating against. But when it comes to Roger Moore's portrayal, I think his attitude to some of his enemies goes beyond political advantage.
Roger, I wonder if you have made Bond less lethal. He seems to me now to be less of a cold killer, more reluctant. I know he's still licensed to kill, more reluctant to kill. Do you sense that as you pass through the films?
Well, I always played it with a certain reluctance to kill, because my only key to playing a Bond that I had from the books was at the beginning of one of Fleming's stories, where it said Bond was on his way back from Mexico, where he had eliminated somebody. He didn't like killing particularly, but he took a pride in doing his job well. And that's my key to it. I don't like killing.
It's like Bond believes that there are good and bad traits that exist in human beings, and he's open to the possibility that people who do bad things can still do good things if they choose to, just as he's open to the possibility of killing them if it becomes necessary. His mostly carefree and stress-free attitude is unrealistic in the world of espionage, but as an everyday person myself, I really dig his attitude. He is like Christopher Reeve's Superman. Despite all of the stress and all of the social division and all of the trust barriers we have in real life, that can be argued to be justified in many circumstances. We can still look up to James Bond as a role model of how we can make our personal existence and our coexistence with the good and bad sides of society better in some ways. Actually, having just mentioned Superman, Roger Moore did comment on the invincibility factor in this quote from page 415 of Some Kind of Hero. That quote is a key example of him having commented loads of times of the unrealism and silliness of the movies he's been in. Yeah, he always knew the James Bond fantasy is a load of bollocks, and he goes along with it even after having facelift. And yes, he did badmouth some aspects of his movies, but just because someone dislikes their own works for one reason or another, does not discount whatever quality the work actually has. This is the case with many famous performances and artwork. Roger did put in some silliness in his movies himself. This little moment was said to have been made up by Roger. He was also renowned for pranking other actors and crew on set. His prankster attitude extended towards animals.
I thought it would be a very smart idea when we were doing the wardrobe for this scene and suggested to Guy that I would wear, which I would never do today, but at that time thought was smart, wear alligator shoes or crocodile shoes. What a stupid thing to do. Might have been a distant cousin of one of them. There might still be today, waiting for a nice fat English actor to come back.
Regarding the other actors' opinions on the Bond films, yes, they all did comment on the fantasy nature of the movies too, but when you look in depth of their interviews on how they portrayed the James Bond character, their ulterior intentions were significantly different from Roger Moore's, who, like Sean Connery, can get a bit annoyed of feeling typecast as James Bond. Comparing that kind of attitude with Pierce Brosnan's, for example, I do like him in GoldenEye personally, but from what I read, he did come across to me as if he was too carried away with a fantasy. And I think that's a key contributing factor of his performances in his follow-up films feeling weaker. Sean Connery's portrayal taps into the more adolescent appeals, and nothing wrong with that, Sean still delivered. For I think his performance as Bond literally matured when he played him in Never Say Never Again. Sean combined his trademark mannerisms with some of Roger Moore's charms. I think that worked well. In reading the book Some Kind of Hero, I kept finding quotes from filmmakers and actors that their portrayal of Bond needs to be fairly serious for the most part. I read that actors like Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig wanted to portray Bond as an emotionally and physically vulnerable human being beneath the cool tough guy surface who makes mistakes. And I am assuming they intended that way to make their portrayals more emotionally relatable to viewers. However, the James Bond fantasy inevitably limits the dramatic scope of the Bond character and the kind of journey he goes through from story to story. Living Daylights did show off Timothy Dalton's performance, but he doesn't really have a journey or a significant character arc, he just has the same kind of adventure of the previous movies. With License to Kill, it's a simple revenge story where Dalton just fulfills his lust for revenge against cardboard bad guys and that's it really. Casino Royale did emphasize character drama a lot, and I think it did work for me a bit as a kid. But as an adult rewatching the movie, I don't feel emotionally invested in the story. It conformed to the more basic appeals of the James Bond franchise. Bond may get badly hurt, but he still has too much blind luck. It has a tragic love story, albeit a scripted one, but it still included an over-the-top action piece in its climax. Characters may insult Bond for his ego issues, but the film still consistently promotes Bond as a cool, tough guy. The franchise is named after him, after all. This isn't just about his demeanour or his unrealistic capabilities. I do also count the torture scene as a tough guy display. The fantasy of tough guys being able to withstand injury to the testicles, which we men get every now and then. All of this is not helped by half-baked script writing, which carried on in the other Daniel Craig films, and because the half-baked script writing, Craig's Bond is so lacking of interesting subtleties that we explored from Sean Connery and Roger Moore, the kinds of subtleties that goes beyond the cool tough guy image. To put the tough guy image into context, people complain about Roger Moore's Bond having to do embarrassing things in the story, but I think there is point to it. We all have been in situations in life, even in adulthood, where we have been put into embarrassing situations we have to go through. And so, what Roger Moore's portrayal did, which stands out from the other Bond actors, is that he is willing to subject himself to embarrassment if this has become the only necessary option left. If Bond was not chased by local authorities in Octopussy, and if he had more time to defuse a bomb, he'd probably avoid the clown costume, but he does not always have that luxury. Same thing with this scene in The Man with the Golden Gun, where he grabbed some ass. If we are going to be realistic here, if we are put in the same shoes as a character in those situations, chances are we would have to grab ass or die. I believe this is something that the other Bond actors cannot compete with Roger on, and perhaps this is an uncomfortable truth for people who get upset when their cool tough guy fantasy is spoiled. But I think that makes the James Bond character more relatable. Roger went a step further though, in that he parodied himself as a person in the 1981 comedy film The Cannonball Run by playing a character who impersonates Roger Moore.
Step back, my dear. I must warn you, I'm Roger Moore. Roger Moore.
Mr. Point, how did you like that?
Well, with the lighter, of course.
That's odd.
I cannot recall any of the Bond actors who lampooned themselves in that extreme, even compared to that parody video Daniel Craig did. Actually, here's a whopping snippet from page 572 of the book Some Kind of Hero. Chris McGurk, who was an executive of MGM at the time, he was the very first person to spot the idea of casting Daniel Craig in a James Bond film. But from the outset he said he would have been, quote, a great Bond villain, end quote. Come to think of it, I think it's true. Daniel Craig is a good actor, his charisma did show in his movies, but scriptwriters should have allowed him to show more warmth, humour and especially wit. But Daniel Craig's ice-cold body language and delivery makes him more ideal for villain roles, perhaps Red Grant, and my god I can really picture him as the henchman from Living Daylights. The basic fact is, James Bond is ultimately a superhero with a tuxedo. You can make him appear cool or human however you see it, even if your idea of being cool involves hiring an actor who's fit and turn him into a psychopathic killing machine. But at the end of the day, Daniel Craig's Bond is as much a fictional archetype as Roger Moore's Bond and all the other actors who play the character. For me, my subjective definition of cool is more about social capability, intelligent wisdom, creativity and humour, which Roger Moore, Sean Connery and the likes fit the bill, given what we explored so far. I will finish this chapter with one more point. It sounds simple, but it's a point that is so lost in modern action movies, it needs to be brought back in some way. Compared to Daniel Craig's Bond incarnation, who is physically agile and can climb construction walls without slipping on his sweat. James Bond, especially played by Sean Connery and Roger Moore, usually have very basic physicality. Now sure, this sort of thing is contradicted by the character occasionally doing physically intense stunts, But this basic point makes Bond a relatable character in a physical sense. Audiences tend to be in less shape than even the actors who play Bond, and so we sort of identify with James Bond on that level. I will be expanding on that issue in the next chapter in terms of how the movies portray physical capability of the different characters. I think there is more subtleties in how James Bond is written and acted from one movie to the next throughout the series, but I mainly cover details that are relevant to this topic of artistic license, with some additional thoughts that I think is worth mentioning for you to think over the next time you watch these movies. I like all of the James Bond actors, and I personally have been divided upon choosing Sean Connery and Roger Moore as my favourite. But having rewatched the movies again and thinking about the appeals of a character, and Roger arguably having the most honest and mature attitude in portraying the character, I am more firm in saying that Roger Moore was, and still is, the very best James Bond actor ever.